This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store, and now you can rate the podcast on Spotify. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. A reminder that we have a number of community events taking place. We have 2 different book clubs that are running, one on Carl Sagan's Cosmos and one on the philosophy of science. We also have a weekly meeting that's taking place on Tuesday evenings at 5:30 Pacific, 8:30 Eastern. Come and join, participate, be a part of the community. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's podcast. On to today's show. My guest today is Natalie. Natalie has a fascinating story, and what's most important about it is that she has been deconverted for over 30 years. Why that's important is so much of the evangelical response to deconstruction these days is about how trendy it is or how people want to be cool. I think Natalie swiftly debunks that concept by having gone through this process alone with no blogs, no podcasts, no YouTube channels. But just from her reading of literature, you're going to hear her mention that Judy Blume's "Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret" was significant for her. But literature in general were the devices that allowed Natalie to escape in her mind. Natalie also talks about growing up in the South, in that in many ways she was escaping the South more than anything. But Natalie's quite the character. She talks about having read a lot of Christian fiction and that the exciting characters in those stories were the prostitutes. So she had a fantasy in her mind of running away and being a prostitute one day. That isn't quite how it turned out, but she is quite the amazing person. Here is Natalie to tell her story. Natalie, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you.
Natalie, thank you for reaching out to me. I think you have a really interesting story, potentially being someone who went through this process long before there were podcasts and blogs and people talking about it out in the open. But let's begin with, what was your faith tradition growing up?
Grew up in a traditional Christian household, but because we lived in the South for most of from the time I was 5 until I was 17, Southern Baptist.
Okay. And was that a positive experience, a negative experience, neutral?
The South for me was a very negative experience, the South in general.
Okay.
And I said by the time I was 17, because I left the South when I was 17 years old, just out of a desperate need of survival. Some things that were happening in the South that for some reason, it didn't sit well with me. So,
yeah.
And that was also about the time the whole religion thing started becoming questioned. I was questioning everything, the Southern lifestyle plus the religion. And so I call it my escape when I was 17.
Okay.
So.
Interesting. All right. So one more question about that younger period though is, was faith something that you personally had, or was it something that you had just, been handed down?
It's interesting. My earliest memory is when I was 5. And I think what I eventually learned as I got older was there was so much that had happened before I even realized my life was happening.
Yeah.
That influenced my religious experience. So at the age of 7, I was, went down the aisle to the altar, professed my sins, became saved, baptized, the whole works. And as a 53-year-old woman, I have a lot of regret that was the one choice I was never able to make. It was something that I recall becoming saved because of the fear of being left behind. I mean,
Right.
I have a memory of being in the back of the car. My father was driving, and I looked around and realized that if it was true, and if I wasn't a believer, I would be left in that back seat by myself in the blink of an eye. And I think there was a lot of that I think resulted in my feeling that call that one Sunday when I went forward and, became saved.
So, yeah, I think you're expressing something that a lot of the listeners do as well, kind of a hell anxiety or a rapture anxiety that, again, as a child, you're told, hey, in an instant, everybody's going to be gone. And if you aren't certain, that would be terrifying. That would be absolutely terrifying.
Right.
So then in your teen years, you're starting to question kind of cultural issues as well as the religious ones. What was that like?
What really started it was the family issues. For all that my parents believed in Christianity and God's will, my mother was so unhappy as a stay at home mom of 6 kids. And I just remember money was always an issue. We would tithe our 10% and then get the Christmas package from the church because we were
Hmm.
one of the poor families in the church. And that created such anxiety. When God provided, she was on top of the world. When the money, I mean, how do you support 6 kids on one paycheck?
Yeah.
And she refused to work because God had meant for her to be a stay at home mom of 6 children. I was a big reader and reading books. Judy Blume had probably the biggest influence on my questioning everything.
Interesting. Okay.
That I remember getting the packet of the collection of her works about the time that I was probably in middle school, and my aunt, my mother's sister, had sent it to me.
Hmm.
My mother never questioned what I read. So because it came from her sister, she gave it to me. And I jokingly think that, "Are you there, God? It's me, Margaret." She was just convinced that it was some religious book or whatever. But
Right. Right.
I read that book last year, and I had forgotten how it is really about Margaret questioning her religious beliefs. I mean, who is she and what does she believe?
Yeah.
What I took from it was the message about sexuality, of learning about your body, which was completely forbidden as I was growing up. That stuff was not taught in the household, wasn't really taught in schools. And so I learned a lot about life outside of a Christian family through reading. And at one point, I read Bloom's Forever. And in that story was a mother-daughter relationship where the mother wanted what was best for her daughter. And so part of that was honesty about what to expect as a young woman who was experiencing sexuality. And it just kind of blew my mind that those types of relationships could exist outside of religion. Outside of religion, I was taught that, this was humanistic. This was a mother not caring for her daughter's soul. And yet it was so beautiful the way the daughter felt so secure with her mother to ask these questions and to learn about what it meant to be a human being, a young woman
Yeah.
growing. So I think that all of that reading, all of that trying to connect with what I wanted out of my life, and then watching my parents struggle, but still that religion was so extreme. I think it just caused me to start questioning in my teenage years. What is really, how can you be so unhappy and still have these beliefs about this religion?
Fascinating that, reading books about other people and even fiction, right, can have such a huge impact on you as you recognize that the worldview that you've been given may not be the only option that is out there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then let's get into as well some of the cultural things. So you mentioned that the southernness was difficult. So what were some of the issues that were there?
When I was growing up, our religion, we just weren't Christian. We were predestined. And
Yeah.
that was if I can go back and kind of talk about my parents' religious
Yeah.
upbringings. I was born in West Virginia, where my dad had been born and raised, and my dad left when I was 2. And I had grown up thinking that my dad had been non-religious until he met my mother and had this, religious experience. Basically, my grandmother led my father to Jesus, is a story that I've always heard.
Okay.
My mother's mother led him to salvation. what I learned later is that his mother was extremely religious. She was a churchgoer. She had a I mean, it was Church of Christ, but it was still a religious belief.
Yeah.
It almost became that his conversion and marriage into my mother's family was almost the kickstart of his religious life.
Right.
And so it was a big belief that from that point forward, anything that he had done in the past had been erased by this. God had forgiven him of his sins. He had married into this very religious family. And so therefore he had been rescued from what had ever happened before. What had happened before is he'd had a child.
Ah.
I have a half sister who is 7 years old that he practically abandoned once he
Okay.
started a family with my mother. I mean, he was very young. His girlfriend was very young, but the child still existed.
Yeah.
And so I've come to find out, my dad died last year,
Oh, I'm very sorry.
and my half sister had a memorial service for him in West Virginia. So I got to go back, and I learned from her that she had no contact with my father, that she reached out to me because she wanted to know what he had been like. She grew up in a very poor, loved by her mother, but she did not have the same privileges that I had growing up in a two-parent household.
Right.
For all the issues I had growing up, I still felt pretty safe with my parents, and I never went hungry. Her mother struggled. There was just no contact between her and my father. And it just kind of rocked my world to think about how my father had led the six of us. I'm the oldest of six. That the kids the kids he raised, we had Bible study regularly. We were made to go to church. He prayed for our souls. It was an expectation that we were privileged because of our religious upbringing.
Mm.
We had a place in heaven. We were the chosen ones. And then all of a sudden I find out about this daughter.
Yeah.
That's another thing that just kind of rocked my world, where I went, it doesn't connect. So then that privilege goes into racial privilege of growing up in a white Southern Baptist church. Right down the road is the Black neighborhood. There's
Mhm.
no integration. Integration had just happened at the school I was going to. I was going to school in the late 70s and through the 80s. I graduated in 1986 from high school.
Okay.
And so I felt that struggle in the classroom and in the school, but then I went to church where it was never talked about. It was a complete separation of community and religion. And yet the missionaries would come and show their slides about the brown people in South America
Mm.
and Africa that we were saving. And my mother's family were missionaries with the New Tribes Mission. And there was this message of going to save, all the language that they used to use.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
while we weren't considered racist, I don't recall any real effort to witness within our own community. It was a very segregated church experience.
Yeah.
And so to me, it felt like a lot of privilege. It felt like this prayer of God's will be done is really just make sure that I get what I need to continue living my life.
Yeah.
Is how it came across to me. So
I do think, as somewhat of an outside observer at this point, you recognize how compartmentalized everything was. Like you say, missionaries going out to reach people of color, and yet people of color are just down the street who
right,
you don't ever talk to.
right. And weren't ever encouraged to go in the neighborhood. I mean, my parents, for not being we weren't allowed to speak racist language and things of that sort, but I certainly wasn't encouraged to have friends come home.
Mm.
And I did have a girlfriend that came home with me, and I felt just such nervousness by my parents that she was going to ride the school bus and that the neighborhood would see that she was in. So I experienced that growing up. A lot of the kids I went to church with went to the Christian school, And when they raised the tuition and they had to go to public school, there was a lot of outrage in the church about what their children were going to experience going to public school just
Wow.
because the Christian school had raised tuition. So I lived through that quite a bit in the South. In Georgia is where I grew up. And a lot of that just got me to thinking about, it can't be like this everywhere. And I knew it wasn't like this everywhere because I was reading so much.
Right.
And so it became more than I could handle at some point.
And then, like, did you have a moment where you thought, I don't believe this anymore? I don't think this is right?
I had a moment where I certainly felt like I had to get out of the South or I was going to get stuck. And I felt like it wasn't making sense. I don't think I ever came to the this isn't right until I was probably in my 20s.
Okay. Okay.
But I think a lot of what I was seeing that I was starting to question allowed me to do this in the 20s to come to a realization that it just wasn't speaking to me anymore. I couldn't live with under this belief system. So
I think a common theme we hear is, if this thing is not true, then what else may not be true? And so it sounds like in your case, it's kind of the cultural way that the South was handling racial issues you began to question, and then
right,
maybe you were also questioning the other, because Southern Baptism is a deep part of Southern
right.
culture as well, to begin to question that as well.
And by that time too, my parents had come to where they were getting very deeply into the predestined, and so they were coming. They came at odds with the church, and they eventually left. My dad got transferred out of Georgia,
Okay.
and they were fortunate enough to leave that area because of their beliefs in. They started following the grace movement.
Okay.
The learning of the Greek language, the original text, that kind of teaching. My grandmother's third husband was very big into that religious movement. So
Okay.
I grew up, there. My parents. It's funny you talk about podcasts, and I grew up listening. My mother listened to James Dobson.
Yeah.
My mother also got tapes in the mail of the Greek language and how to read the Bible, the original text. My
Wow.
father went to seminary school at Chattanooga, Tennessee Temple University in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Okay.
And so they had some of that background. Studying the Bible was very much a big deal for them. They were very scholarly in their interpretation of the Bible.
How about you? Did you dig into that at all? The kind of the
Well, so I left when I was 17. My grandmother's husband died, and she asked me to come stay with her for the summer. And I went to Portland, and then I traveled around the West Coast with her.
Okay.
I didn't go back. I just didn't go back to Georgia. My mother called one day and said, "Can I get a return ticket?" And I said, "Oh, I'm not coming back. I'm going to stay here." I talked an aunt and uncle into letting me finish high school in Portland, Oregon.
Oh, okay.
And so, but it was interesting because what I find so humorous is you make these little steps to break the binds, but I went to a school called Canyon View Bible College in Silverton, Oregon, right after high school.
Okay.
Now, I was already not believing, but there was such a family expectation of following in the footsteps that I didn't feel I had a choice other than to go to this Canyon View. And one, I didn't want to go back to the South, and I didn't have a plan. And I thought, well, this will at least keep me on the West Coast. This will keep me in Oregon. This will keep me away from the South. What's the irony is I was accepted to Boston College, and I
Oh,
never
wow.
pursued looking for scholarships, looking at accepting. I just assumed this was my next step.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
I went back to Georgia for just for like the summer. And then I went back to Oregon, to Silverton, Oregon, outside of Salem. to go to a seminary school and started the program there. So, and my grandmother and her husband had been big influencers of this school, had given a lot of money, were kind of rock stars, kind of
Right.
superstars when it came to this program. So I came in kind of with a legacy. So I started this program. So
So I wanted to highlight a couple of things. One, I imagine that going from Georgia to Oregon, and specifically if you're in the Portland or Salem area, you know, pretty dramatic cultural change
yes.
there. But the flip side of that is that in little rural towns around the Portland area, you can have some very conservative culture there as well. So it sounds like
hmm
I'm not familiar with Silverton, but it sounds like maybe Silverton was a bit more conservative.
Uh, I didn't know a whole lot about Silverton. I was just, it was, like you said, it's such a small town.
Yeah.
I went to class and I worked at the local Safeway, and that's all I did for the time that I was there. And I didn't know a whole lot about the community.
Okay.
The university, the college was so cut off from the outside world that I didn't know a whole lot about, the area.
Yeah. So that's my next question: is what was that experience like, both as a young adult and then someone who was also questioning kind of the underpinnings of the entire process there. As an example, I went to Bible college in the Santa Cruz area, so again, very culturally liberal and in this little tiny bubble of hyper conservatism. And there were some very good things about it, but there was also very infantilizing, right? Like they treated
hmm
us like
hmm
children when we were supposed to be becoming adults. So I'm curious what your experience was.
I started school in September. By February, I was asked to leave campus because I
Oh,
had been caught with a boyfriend
oh
in
dear.
an inappropriate situation.
Okay.
So I remember, again, being in Oregon, I always go back to that as the time that I figured out I could leave any situation if I really wanted to. If there was a situation where I wasn't safe, I had the courage to pack up and leave, because
Yeah.
moving to Portland was never a hardship for me. I mean, my senior year in high school, it didn't phase me at all. I didn't feel like I had missed anything in Georgia. So going to Silverton to go to Bible college had just really been an opportunity to stay in Oregon.
Right.
Met a guy at the Safeway who was not a student at all. And they didn't even really want me working at Safeway. I don't think they encourage students leaving campus,
Interesting.
but I didn't have enough money. My parents really couldn't afford to pay the tuition, and so I had to work in order to pay bills, and so I think they begrudgingly let me go to work. And I met a guy, and we hit it off, and I think I was drawn to the fact that he had no religious ambitions at all.
Mm-hmm.
I was feeling pretty stifled on campus. It seemed that a lot of the women that had gone there were there looking for a spouse. There was a lot of the kind of the spousal MRS degree
Yeah.
happening.
A ring by spring.
Yes, there was a
Yeah.
lot of that, a
Yeah.
lot of that. And so I think work was a positive escape for me. But I got in trouble. I got caught, and I was asked to leave.
Oh
And
man.
so that was that.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I definitely, I dodged some bullets there, and I had friends who got caught as well, and like it's amazing how, again, from the outside as an adult now, I
hmm
look back on that and think, what an absurd situation.
Yeah, right. And I also remember there were girls that were having serious emotional issues. I remember a lot of chaos on that campus, and just the laying on of hands and prayers, even for a program that I didn't feel was all that traditionally religious. They still had the way of treating females as out of hand,
Mm,
things that just weren't acceptable. And so I look back on that now and just go, well, I think there's some things going on that, I probably didn't even realize with other students, but I'm the one that ended up leaving, and it was good. It was great that I was asked to go. So
Yeah, interesting. You're asked to leave. What happens next, and how did you feel about that? Did you feel relief or did you feel devastated?
I didn't feel devastated. It's funny, I didn't feel devastated. I had a younger sister. There was some family drama that was happening, and I think my mother had reached out to me. They had moved from Georgia by then to South Carolina, where my dad had been transferred with his job. And my mother really wanted me to come to South Carolina. It was almost forgiven what happened to me because she was so desperate for help in the situation that had happened that I think a lot of it was just overlooked. Like, I don't remember there ever being a conversation about why I was asked to leave. She must have known.
Yeah.
But my family was very good at kind of burying those types of things. It was never, we just didn't talk about it, you know. And so I took a side trip. I got a car in Oregon and I drove to Colorado and I stayed for the summer and had a great time. And then sold that car in Longmont, Colorado, and went to South Carolina where my family was and got a job. And we were only there for 8 months. And then my dad was transferred to Alabama. And so I went with them to Alabama because I could live at home and with for free tuition. There was a college nearby where we had moved in Alabama. So I was back at home and not, I think I was more unhappy about being back in the South and at home than I was anything else.
Okay.
I just couldn't believe that I was back where I had, left off at 17. So
Yeah. And roughly how old were you at that point in time?
I was 19.
Oh,
I
okay.
think I
We're
was
still pretty
19.
young.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
I was 19. I finally left Alabama when I was 22. So I was, there.
And that local college experience, was that positive?
It was very positive. My mother was I had always been encouraged that to go to college. My mother didn't seem to have any issues. My dad was a seminary student, but still considered a college graduate.
Yeah.
And I was encouraged, but my mother was so afraid I was going to become a humanist. I mean, that was her biggest fear was, yeah, you need to go to college, but I just feel that you just be careful with what you learn. Of course, I was reading everything. So I think reading is really was the gateway for me
Yeah.
to questioning everything. I went to Auburn University at Montgomery, which was a liberal arts school. I was an English major. So of course, what I was reading was just an exposure to all kinds of um, philosophy, all of this, and I loved it. I loved being in college. It was a wonderful experience, but I was still going home every night to, my family, and there was, you interviewed my brother Nathan. He's my youngest brother.
Oh,
Nathan Postaway. Yeah.
okay.
And there was a lot of chaos happening in the family in Alabama. Georgia was my least favorite place. Alabama was Nathan's least favorite place.
Yeah. Okay.
And so because I was working and going to school, I wasn't a part. Nathan and I are 9.5 years apart. So I wasn't a big part of a lot of it. But my whole goal once I got to Alabama was to graduate and to get out as soon as I could. I had no goal to stay. And so that was as soon as I got there, I was working to get out, and college education was going to do that for me.
Yeah.
So that was the plan.
I mean, I could go on and on about how good education is. But
Yes.
just even a completely useless degree just gets you
Right.
out of the house, gets you, exposed to ideas that you wouldn't otherwise be a part of. So yeah, that's fantastic.
Right.
And and good on your parents for encouraging you to seek an education. But it's interesting. I did want to highlight, the fear that Christian parents have about their children going off to college, and in some cases, even Bible colleges, where they rightly fear that exposure will change their minds in some way or another. And
Hmm.
I think I've mentioned on Mike, I had a pastor who warned me before I went to Bible college about losing my faith. So,
Right.
and in your case, though, it sounds like you already had, significant doubts going in. So how did that play out?
Um, it's so funny. I realized I was the type of person that could play the Christian with the best of them. I had the ability to balance to straddle both of those worlds. This is a time in Alabama when my parents were having so many emotional family issues that they were no longer practicing Christianity as much as, like, they weren't going to church.
Okay.
They were studying the Bible together. There was still a lot of that, but their children were causing quite a few issues, not just me, but several of us. And I think they were just trying to keep their head above water as far as raising 6 kids in this scary world.
Okay.
But I was able to go home I could live both of those worlds. I could talk with my parents. I mean, here's an example. I was married for almost 3 months before my parents even knew. And
Oh, wow.
here's how my parents met the guy. He came walking through the house to get me so that we could go to the courthouse and get married. And my mother had no idea that's who this was. So
Okay.
I kept my life so separate from what was going on at home from them. And, I just lived a completely different life. I did tell my parents that I was married, and my mother was so upset, but I think I really made her more upset when I gleefully told her that he was not a practicing Christian.
Oh, no.
And
Yeah.
that to me was like probably my last independent, probably the rock that I hurled at the whole facade of the thing was just to say, look, I'm done.
Yeah. So again, I'm fascinated because, the brunt of my interviews are young millennials who, they grew up in the 90s and through the purity culture and are just now becoming adults themselves and are coming to the conclusion that this isn't true. The process is very similar, right? There's
Hmm.
this is from time immemorial, right? Like people have been going through this. But what I want to get out from your story is, what that was like in a time where, I'm assuming you're still in the South for a bit here, and you're surrounded by cultural Christianity, and there isn't the kind of popular movement, as it were, of people who are saying, I'm done. I'm walking away from this. So did you feel isolated in that fact, or was it, or, your new husband, also not religious, and so that just wasn't an issue, or what was that like for you?
The South is interesting. Everyone says they're Christian in the South.
Yeah.
And so it's like you said, it's such a cultural thing that everyone, just if you're a good person, you say, I'm a Christian. I'm a believer in God. I think what I was struggling with was the idea that maybe I didn't believe there was a God anymore. And certainly I didn't believe that there was a supreme being that was monitoring my life, or that I should feel obligated to check in with every day to make sure that everything was going well.
Right.
I had a lot of there's a lot of I had a lot of friends of color, Black friends, whose grandmothers believed voraciously in this supreme being. And with the history of the South, I couldn't understand why they weren't questioning any of it.
Yeah.
So I think that was helping me too, to kind of go, I don't understand how we can have this belief of this God, and yet we know the history of what's been going on, and we seem to be that this God allowed all of this to happen.
Right.
I think is what I was coming to. It just did not make any sense to me that, but like I said, the Southerners really, there's something about God, a belief in God for them, the whole culture is just hard to question and bring that into a conversation. I didn't feel isolated because I didn't even have to talk about it. It was just
Sure.
assumed.
Right. Exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
I didn't even have to say, oh, I'm not a believer, because I could be out drinking with a whole bunch of college students and they were all believers, but for now they were drinking. So it wasn't really it didn't seem to be anything that I had to quite um, deal with at the moment.
Yeah.
It was, what I had to deal with once again was how to get out of the South, how to get a life outside of my family, and how to make sure that my goals and aspirations were met was my biggest fear.
Well, do you want to talk about that? Like the next phase of
Yes.
your life? What how did you get out of the South?
Well, I got pregnant, and
Okay.
we got married. We married with the agreement. It was a business deal. He needed financial aid,
Yeah.
and I said, "Well, why don't we get married?" So we did, but the deal was always that we would, if it didn't work out, we would just go our separate ways. And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I what I found in him is a man that we moved from Alabama so that I could go to graduate school, and our whole life has been that way. It's my turn, and then it was his turn. It was my turn, and then it was his turn.
Right.
And so he was not a Southerner. Was a military brat. He had been all over the world, and we married. And he graduated a year after I graduated, and I was accepted to the University of Michigan for graduate school.
Okay.
And we had our son. He was about 18 months old when we went to graduate school. And I think the fact that I had a relationship where I was able to make sure what I needed without any outside influence, I
Hmm.
think that allowed me to start really questioning what my life was about, because I defied all the Christian rules and still ended up in a successful relationship in a graduate school, making it work. And I found that I wasn't relying on a belief in God to survive.
Right.
That fear had somehow disappeared. I just didn't have that need to have a religious belief. And from then, we went to Arizona with my first job, and then he announced that he'd been accepted to the University of Alaska in Fairbanks.
Wow.
And he moved to Fairbanks, and I followed a year later with our two children. We had two kids by then. And I think it was and the further I got from my family, the easier it became, until I think in my late 20s, early 30s, woke up one day and just realized I hadn't thought about a God for a long time. We went through a lot of hardship, getting to Alaska, not having enough money, being young.
Yeah.
And I, at some point, realized that I was not saying those prayers, if it's your will, please make sure this happens. We were just making it happen.
Right.
We were
Just
just
getting about
we were
the
just
business
making
of
it
living.
happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it
Yeah.
was just like, what's best for us. And but I want to go back, because I think one other chink, my mother helped me along the way, because she came to stay with me after my husband left for Alaska.
Okay.
And she came to stay for several weeks. And I had just taken my husband to the airport, and we were walking my kids. And she had had a chance to live with us for 5 days and watch how my husband and I interacted, how we were raising our children. And she stopped during our walk and said that she felt that he was never going to be there for me when I desperately needed him, because he wasn't a Christian.
Mm.
And I think that was the time that I realized that all that I had seen growing up with her, she had somehow bought into some belief that I had obviously proven this wrong.
Right.
I mean, I was like, we just went through. We'd been married 5 years by then, and if the last 5 years weren't a time for him to leave, I don't know when a good time would have been.
Yeah.
And he was always telling me, "Yes, you can do this. Yes, let's try it. I'm behind you. I support you," in a way that no one had ever done.
Right.
And so I had to just say to her, if you ever discuss my marriage like this again, you won't be able to see, you won't be able to visit. I had to draw a boundary around the relationship. And I think that was probably the easiest. That's when it got easy for me to start really questioning. And I think that's when I began regretting the salvation at 7, because I was never given a chance to watch what was happening around me and make my own choice.
Yeah.
And so at the age of 25, when she said this to me, I was able to say, I think I was 26 maybe, but I was able to say to her, "I'm not going to believe what you say, and you have no right to say this to me," but I couldn't do that at 7. And I think that was a regret that I have, not being able to
Hmm.
have that choice at 7.
Yeah. There's several things here. The idea of just the bubble particularly in something like the South, where you're in a culture, the entire culture is about this. It's all self-referential, self-reinforcing.
Hmm.
Anything that is counter to it, humanism, what have you, philosophy, is shut out, and only the things that are reinforcing are allowed in. So one of the things I think that's really important is you just got out of the context.
Right.
Just moving at all, ever, put you out of that same context, gave you an opportunity to reflect on things. But certainly as a child, there's no way, right? I think what I'm seeing now with this wave of people deconstructing and deconverting is the indoctrination of children is harmful. And in
Yeah.
some ways, I think that's what you experienced. And you're feeling that regret of, you could not possibly, but I guess the point I want to make is to release you from that regret. Like
Oh
you
yeah.
couldn't
Oh yeah. Yeah.
possibly have had any control over
No.
that situation.
No.
So,
No.
yeah,
I mean, we can feel regret over everything as a
sure.
child. You know,
Yes.
the very fact that my first memory is at 5, and I wonder, well, what happened before?
Yeah.
Is there's just, you have no control over that. You know, that just is, it is what it is. So.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm curious then, as an adult now, and watching what is happening, what I think of as kind of the first wave was the after September 11th, and we get some very vocal atheists who come out and start criticizing religion. And I feel like we're in a second or third wave at this point of people who have the freedom to begin questioning, and in a way culturally kind of as a movement that didn't exist prior to this. So I'm curious what your thoughts are in just watching this happen.
I have a family member who best represents the cultural or the family link to religion. She wrote a letter, a Christmas, I think it was a Christmas letter to a bunch of us, and she said that she trusts God's judgment, but she's not sure what God was doing when He allowed Biden to become president.
Mm. Okay. Yeah.
It still exists.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still there. I'm overwhelmed. I'm beginning to see the religious belief similar to a belief in anything. And I think I'm reminded of the South when I hear Christians say, well, I'm a Christian, I have a belief in God, but then perform these behaviors that I don't understand where they're getting. I have a lot of frustration. Um, I'm angry. I think I'm angry
Yeah.
probably more than anything. And I think too that I'm angry that there's still a belief that we are a God-fearing chosen nation. Because I just, you can look at the history of this country and just, find fault with a lot of that. So
Yeah.
I did not raise children in a religion at all. We did not attend church. Our children were always told that they could attend church, and I think they went a couple times. And we've been very open about our religious beliefs. Um, I think my children are as successful as Christians. You know, I was raised that if you're a Christian, God is going to bless you and you're going to get everything you need. Well, my children weren't raised Christians, and they're successful.
Right.
They're just as happy and unhappy as Christians. And so I just feel that I'm surprised that I'm pleased that more people are coming around and seeing, the danger of some of these beliefs.
Yeah.
We haven't been the country, I think, that we say that we've been.
Yeah. And I think that recent politics have brought this to a head in a way that certainly in my lifetime, and I think we are contemporaries,
Hmm.
I hadn't seen before. There's almost no way to be neutral. You have to take a side.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, and I think that you can't even be. I like the idea to say that you're an atheist. I think is a real dangerous thing, just because everyone is pegging themselves as Christian. I mean, there's just such a need to say, I'm doing this because I'm a Christian, or we're a Christian nation or whatever. That I'm just, I think I would be called a communist or a socialist if I were to say that I was an atheist.
Right.
So.
Yeah. A common theme that's been coming up lately is the idea that the kind of the tribal or the identity belonging comes first and the beliefs come after. And I think that's what part of what we're seeing is that there's in recent politics that, people were already a part of an identity, a sense of conservatism or what have you, or Southernism or what have you. And then the ideas, the beliefs started to go off the rails a bit, even from their own standards as of 15 years ago. But because that identity is so strong and it just pulls people along. And then, from an objective point of view, you think, wow, that's even by your own standards, that seems crazy. So I think this is a fascinating moment in history that we're living through.
But you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the message that I was raised with, that God's always in control.
Yeah.
And I remember questioning that concept, that it was almost as if saying God is in control meant that I don't have to do anything. Like my family members are not political. They're not political. They don't, some of them don't even vote because they feel, well, God's in control. It doesn't matter what we do.
Interesting.
We're not long for this earth. My great grandmother, she left her diaries behind, and she ended every year with, well, the Lord didn't come this year. Hopefully he'll come next year. This was way back in the 40s. I mean,
yeah.
There was this belief that almost that this world can be destroyed because what we're really saving ourselves for is a heaven.
Yeah.
And that heaven is going to obliterate our thought, what we believed was happening on earth. And so earth doesn't even matter to a degree.
Yeah.
And that to me is frightening.
Yeah. The beliefs have consequences, and the inability to respond to things like climate change or even a pandemic where we have a vaccine in
yes,
in a rapid amount of time,
right,
is bad, right? And I think this is the upside of people being vocal and
right,
being able to criticize religion these days, is that those are bad ideas, and
right,
and we need to respond to these very eminent threats.
right. And there doesn't seem to be a questioning of their own beliefs. I mean, I think what I like about people who deconvert is they have to go through a questioning process. I mean,
Yeah.
you have to take everything that you have been told most of your life and run it through a ringer to see what is true, what rings true for you. And a lot of it doesn't survive. A lot of it can't survive that process. So
Yeah, and I think the questioning, that questioning phase is valuable even if you wind up remaining in your faith. It's just,
yes,
you come out, the unexamined life, right? Like,
right.
just going through that of like, this, I believe this part and I don't believe this. That's a valuable process
Right.
regardless. So.
I think another thing too is I've mentioned how books have been so important to my deconversion way before I even knew. I don't know that. I think this idea that the Bible is the only word that Christians are to be reading, and then of course the interpretations or the study of the Bible. My parents didn't read much outside of the
Right.
biblical. To me, books are a way to help with that process. I mean, it shows you how valuable other ideas and thoughts and people are. And I just feel that sometimes that's not being allowed either. So,
Well, that's a great segue for us to wrap up. You've mentioned Judy Blume, but were there other authors or books that were helpful for you along the way?
it's funny that John, I don't know if you mentioned, do you remember The Cross and the Switchblade, the movie? So this
Vaguely.
was Eric
Yeah, yeah.
Estrada. This was Eric Estrada before he was a Chips
Okay.
star.
Okay.
And the whole thing is Pat Boone is a minister who reaches out to the gang members and converts the Eric Estrada character.
Okay.
So that was played all through my, in my middle school, I think. That was one of the films that we watched. But then I kind of went from there to finding out about this book series by an author named John Benton. And it was a series of fictional accounts of mostly young women who were drug dealers or prostitutes, and they went to the big city, but they were converted. It
Yeah.
reminded me so much of The Cross and the Switchblade. So when I was in Camilla, wanting desperately to leave, I imagined that maybe I would just run away and be a prostitute. At least I'd make it to New York, and I could be, and I could. I'd already been converted, so it
Yeah,
wouldn't
yeah.
be that big of a deal. My soul had already been saved, so I would probably survive. I think it's funny how my mind kind of warped these stories into ways of fleeing
Escape.
the religious belief.
Yeah.
I mean, I just so desperately needed. I felt like I was um, doing okay by reading these works of Christian literature, but then my mind would warp the storyline, and I
Yeah.
was more attracted to the idea of being a prostitute or being a drug dealer or being,
I love it.
a thief than I was, and then at the end I'd get saved. I would be okay because all of that would be cleansed, and I would have a story to tell. And
Yeah. So even in other words, even the Christian stories had a exit strategy for you.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, Grace Livingston Hill, the romance novels of the man was always the convict who had been converted in prison or something like that. It was all these warped ideas about, God can cleanse your past and make sure that everything is pure so you can start over. So
Yeah.
so there was a lot of that literature that I think helped me get through, the South.
That's amazing. Natalie, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Yep, thank you.
Final thoughts on the episode. As promised, Natalie is a unique character. I can't say that I've heard anyone else talk about dreaming of running away to be a prostitute. That was a new one for me. But I completely relate to Natalie escaping in her mind in literature and fiction. That expanded her worldview beyond the confines of the bubble she was living in. I am so very impressed with Natalie. Again, we're talking, 30 years ago of escaping not only evangelicalism, but also the Southern racism. A touching story when she talked about the juxtaposing the difference between missionaries who were out in the world trying to convert black and brown people when black and brown people were just down the street, but the church wouldn't talk to them or engage with them. That kind of systemic racism is very hard to see in one's own self. Natalie was able to see that and escape that and move on. I related so much to her descriptions of Bible college. We talked about the fear of parents and church community, that Bible college will lead someone to lose their faith. In Natalie's case, it turned out that she was already doubting before she got there, but it cracked me up that, a boy got her kicked out. So purity culture is not something new. That has been around with us for a very, very long time. I think it's so amazing that Judy Blume's Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret was such a high impact book for her. The aspect of a young woman growing into her sexuality, the aspect of doubting God's existence or goodness, all came to play for her. As we mentioned in the conversation, education is just such an important thing. Reading books and getting out of whatever intellectual, cultural bubbles that we are in is so important to see the world as other people might see it and to know that we don't have a lock on truth. We subsequently determined that I have never interviewed Natalie's brother, Nathan. So, Nathan, if you happen to be listening, reach out to me. We'll get you on the show. I want to thank Natalie for being on the podcast, for telling her story, for being a vanguard of deconstruction and deconversion, and for the honesty and forthrightness in which she told her story. She could have held a lot of those elements back, but she told us exactly what she experienced and how she experienced it. Thank you, Natalie. For the Secular Grace Thought of the Week, I want to riff off of what I said at the intro about Natalie being deconverted for 30 years and retell a story that I have mentioned a couple of times. For so many of us, the moment we poke our head outside of the bubble, it feels like such a lonely and isolating event. I must be the only person who ever has gone through this, who's ever had these doubts, had these feelings, had these emotions. And the truth is that this has been happening as long as there has been faith, there has been doubt. I'll recommend for the 87th time Jennifer Michael Hecht's book, Doubt, A History. Why that was such a significant book for me was that feeling of no one else could possibly have experienced this, and realizing not only is that not true for today, that is not true for 2,500 years ago. There's something comforting in realizing that our experiences are not unique. The reason I bring this all up is Natalie went through deconversion and that feeling of isolation long before the current popular movement of deconstruction. And the very strong response by evangelicals today about the deconstruction movement is to minimize it, to rationalize it, to say that it's people who want street cred, quote unquote. They want to be trendy, even though I think many of our experiences, we left kicking and screaming. We didn't necessarily want to leave. We didn't want to doubt, but that happened to us. And the point I'm making here is that any criticism by evangelicals of the current deconstruction movement is entirely missing the point. The point is that people have been deconverting from religious faiths as long as there have been religious faiths. And I don't know about you, but that gives me comfort. We come from a long line of doubters, and we are not alone. As always, we have some really fun episodes coming up. I have the Ranting Atheist, who is a podcaster in Nigeria. Nigeria being a very heavily religious country, split between Christians and Muslims. So he was a lot of fun to talk to. And I also have interviewed Megan Crozier. Megan is the co-host of the Thereafter podcast and the blogger at the Pursuing Life blog. But Megan has an amazing Twitter presence as well, and she is interesting to compare to Natalie in that Megan is very much a part of this particular moment in time and a leader of the deconstruction voices that we are hearing today. Those episodes are coming up in the next few weeks. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist. You can Google Deconversion. You can Google Secular Grace. You can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.